So the dress is tight at the hips and the lining is actually too tight as well, and that's why you're seeing that puckering around the waist. So the way to fix this is to release the hips, and what I do is insert a strip of stretch fabric into the lining. The first thing to do is to pin where it's actually too tight at the hips. So you'll see I've placed a pin at the top and a pin at the bottom just above the stress points. Measure from the top of the panel down to the first pin and write down the measurement and then put start beside it. Then measure down to the second pin, put the amount down and just put stop. So now you have the reference point for where it's actually tight on the garment, and I'm just showing you in metric. Rather than using black, because I am actually doing this exercise purely for videoing, I'm using white so that you can see what's going on. So I've cut a strip of stretch fabric. The stretch is going across, it's horizontal, and what I'm going to do is unpick the lining from the top where it joins the bodice down to below where it was too tight. This is actually a chain stitch, so it's really quick and easy to unravel. Always goes left to right, so hook it into the stitch and then give it a little bit of a pull, and then you can actually release the other side. Unpick across the top. You'll see there I just literally do one stitch at a time, sliding it in between this seam allowance until that I can actually get my fingers in and then open that section up so that I've got easy access to that seam. When unpicking the overlocking, if it's quite loose, it's really easy to do. If you look at both sides of the overlocking, you'll see on one side it looks like it's almost got a stitch that runs through the loops of the overlocking, and all you need to do is just cut that thread, and you can see what I'm doing there is just literally gathering it through. And because this is actually a very loose fabric and it's a loose overlock, it's really simple to just gather it through, and when that stitch comes out, all of the overlocking will just unravel. So it is a really quick and easy method. However, if this was, say, a fabric like a wool or even a linen, it might not be as simple to do. So repeat that process on the opposite side, and then we'll be ready to attach the stretch fabric into the lining. When attaching the stretch fabric to the side, I prefer to pin it so that I can have the lining on the top, and that way I'm actually stitching into the original seam, and it means that I'm not taking it in any more than necessary. I tend to just place one pin at the very top and do that on the other side as well, so that it's prepared, ready for stitching. When stitching the stretch fabric onto the side seam, I find it better to actually stitch with the original fabric, like this, in this case the lining, on the top, and that way I can actually stitch back into the original seam. I got into the habit of doing that because I saw a lot of people who had done alterations, and when they didn't stitch back into the original seam, you could generally see it. And I just, being a little bit of a perfectionist in some ways, I just wanted to make sure that it looked like it hadn't been altered, or as close to as possible. Stitch all the way down to the end until you come to where the seam has been unpicked, and go right to the very edge. So repeat that on the other side. I've sped up this video a little bit just because it's actually exactly the same as the other side. When it comes to the overlocking, I always overlock so that the stretch fabric is overlocked on the top, and what that will do is actually help to force that seam allowance to the towards the lining so that it sits flat. And then when I come down the other side, so on one section I'm going to go from the bottom to the top, and on the other I'm going to go from the top to the bottom. Now you notice how I want to start the overlocking right on the very edge where that stitching is. You notice where we finished, and it was actually up to the point where it was unpicked. So slide the overlocker in underneath, have the needle up, and then when you lower the needle, it should be going into the position right next to where the original overlocking is. Also, you notice my overlocking has a nice wide overlock, and for those who haven't watched any of my other videos, I actually place the needle in the left hand side and I take the right hand needle out, and I've only got 3 threads in so that I get a nice wide overlock, and it looks a lot more professional. So I'm just going to show you that again. You notice that I'm just trimming away the white because I want to actually put it right up against the overlocker, and therefore I don't want the blades to have to try and cut it, because they won't be able to, because I'm only starting right where I stopped stitching. So whilst the blade is still up, it's not really going to be able to do that. So I wanted it so that it's flush, and then when I overlock, it gives a nice clean overlock. When pinning the second side, again you want the lining on the top, so that means that you'll be working from the bottom or sewing from the bottom up to the top. But of course you want to line up the top first to make sure that that's correct. Place the pin so that it's going through the lining, and then you can work down to the end where it's actually been unpicked, and just making sure that the two sides are even. Once you're happy with the top section, you don't necessarily have to pin all the way down to the bottom, but what I'd prefer to do is to come down to the bottom and make sure that the stretch fabric is lined up on both sides so there's no twists or puckers, and place a pin. And this is the tricky little bit with the sewing of it. You can see that that's all the way down, there's no puckers in it, either any of the fabric. And then you can just work back up to the pins that you've got, and that excess will be cut away. You may find, like I have, that I might need to make a little bit of an adjustment with the pins so that I can actually ease the lining in. And I'm just going to repeat it again on the other side just to show you. I've sped up the video just a little bit. I just showed you there the stretch. Always make sure that the stretch is going across. I actually used a two-way stretch fabric. I just showed you then, I just pulled it both ways. I find that two-way stretch is excellent for this kind of situation where the person needs a little bit of room and a bit of flexibility. And you'll be surprised how many linings in garments are actually too tight. So now we come to the sewing bit, and because it's lined up, you're going to get a perfect V at the bottom by doing it this way, having stitched one side, overlocked one side, and now we come to the other side. So what you can do is basically just start at the original seam and then just sew straight up to the very top. And then what that will do is, if you have ensured that it sits evenly on either side at the bottom, then you'll get a perfect V at the bottom. And I'm just repeating that on the other side just to show you. And you can see that there's a bit of excess from the white stretch, but that's okay because that'll actually be overlocked off. So with the overlocking, because again we want to have the stretch on top, in this instance you'll actually start from the top with the overlocking and you'll work down to the end. And for those of you who, again, haven't watched any of my other videos, you notice that I have what's called a loop turner. And what I do is I slide it into the original overlocking, wrap the end of the overlocking thread on it, and then it actually gives a nice neat finish. We're now going to join the bodice section to the skirt where it was unpicked at each side seam. You'll notice when you're actually doing this that the seam allowance will kind of curl under on one side and out when you turn it. Obviously it'll flip out. What I find when I'm doing it is I try and see which way it is curling, and I will actually put the section that is curling out, I'll put that underneath the foot, because it generally tends to give me easier access to the original seam. Because if you don't join the bodice and the skirt back on the original seam that it was, then you're going to notice that it could force the garment to pucker at that section. Before you iron it, just check and make sure that the two seams are flush. Otherwise you may find that you want to unpick it and redo it, or you may have to just lower the seam just a little bit so that it sits flush. I placed the section at the end even though I hadn't actually joined the bodice and skirt, because I thought it was better off to finish with this rather than and keep the other sections together. Measure down with the measurements that you wrote down for your start pin and your stop pin. When I take something in, I put a dot. When I release something, I put a line. So I've put a line for the start point and I've put a line for the stop point. Now that's actually where the stress point is on the garment. That means that I want to start higher because I want to be right out to the overlocking when I reach those two positions. So we'll mark the other side and then we'll stitch it out. So as I mentioned before, you're not actually going to begin stitching at that line. You're going to begin stitching probably 2 to 3 inches, or 7 or 10 centimeters above that, and you're going to lock off on the seam so that the stitch doesn't unravel, And then by the time you get to that line, you're going to be right out to the very edge of the overlocking. And then you're going to stitch down, and then once you come to the line, you will then slowly start to taper in. And I mean slowly. Do not do it rapidly, because you'll just end up with a pucker. So you want to gradually come down, and then it won't be noticeable. So you can see there that, if you can see with the black stitching, it's a bit hard. Perhaps I should have used a white thread. But you can see that it comes down so that by the time you get to the line, it's out to the edge of the overlocking, and then you can sew down. If you have any concerns that it might pull away because it's so close to the overlocking, just do 2 rows of stitching. So I'm just repeating it here for you, and I'll speed up the video just a little bit. When it comes to the unpicking, if it's not a chain stitch, and this actually isn't, then it's just a matter of unpicking backwards and forwards each side until it's completely unpicked, and then you can iron the seam flat. So you can see there that the stretch fabric, it gives a good stretch on either side, and it won't be noticeable at all. This particular lining was definitely a lot tighter than the outer garment. I'm just showing you the side seam that was actually unpicked. You can see it probably needs another little press. I think I took it off and actually gave it another little press. But you want to actually have it so that it tapers through, and you can see there how it's sitting really nicely at the waist. There's no bunching like there was before. It's sitting nicely over the hip area, down to the thigh area. See, it's nice and smooth, and that's because the lining is now the same width as the body, the outer body of the garment. I hope that this alteration helps you in some way with a garment that you might have trouble with. You can see there, that's what it looked like before, so if you've got something it'll look like that, and that's what it looks like when it's finished. Happy altering!